Over the next 30 to about 40 minutes, I'm going to talk about Globus Connect Server version 5, provide a general overview of the new major version, the new terminology, and present the architecture. And then I'll move on to address specifically the version that was released last week, which is version 5.1, talk to the features that are part of that version, and then I'll do a demo and a walkthrough of installing that particular version and use of that. So once that part is over, then we'll open this up for Q&A. And there are other people monitoring the chat, so if you have questions while I'm speaking, there will be some answers for you there also. So that said, just stepping back to talk a little bit about motivation here. The goal for the Globus team here is to be able to support advanced data management capabilities for researchers. So we are looking at things like opening up the data to the web world, so supporting HTTPS.
It's blue jeans, and it's on here.
Supporting HTTPS access to the data with both authentication and authorization, so you can have more streamlined integration with portals, science gateways, being able to do things like inline viewing, subsetting of data and such, right? So opening up the whole data sitting on your storage system to that universe. And also providing support or enabling adding automation pipelines for be it metadata management or be it policy-driven data management. So being able to support those things there. Given such goals, the Globus Connect version 4 that we have today is limiting. And so we have the next generation of that software, the next evolution of that software, which is Globus Connect Server version 5. Right? The sorts of features we are looking at for version 5. So clearly the top one is HTTPS access to the storage system. So being able to use not just the bulk data transfer protocol, the high performance one grid FTP, but also accessing the data using HTTPS for other use cases. So I alluded to the inline viewing and the preview, so meeting those use cases. Using Globus Auth, which is an OAuth 2 based service that we have for authentication and authorization. It allows us to provide more fine-grained authorization mechanisms. And then from an admin perspective, supporting scale-out deployments. So if you're looking to set up endpoints, and not requiring shared file systems for such setup, being able to do this on demand on the cloud and such. Right? We're also looking at supporting multiple storage systems from the same data transfer node pool. So if you have high performance data transfer nodes set up on your Science DMZ to be able to move the data, not having to set up separate pools for various storage systems, but just be able to add storage types to it. And then another one that the version 5 targets is single port for data access. This is probably one of the often asked features for us, which is not having to open up the ephemeral data access ports on the grid FTP server, but be able to do the single port. And then we're also looking at various improvements to endpoint administration. So you can do automation on your deployments integrated with your own build and deploy systems like Ansible and things. This is a set of features that I highlighted, but this is the arc that GCS Globus Connect Server version 5 is taking, and we are looking to add those features progressively to the version 5. To be able to support these features, we needed a revamp on the architecture. So the version 5 has a slightly different architecture from version 4. In the next few slides, I'm going to walk through that and explain that. So we'll first start with data transfer nodes. So this is a very well understood concept in this community. So we're looking at these servers that are running in the Science DMZ set up for high performance data transfers. So the administrator then installs Globus Connect version 5, so the software on these nodes, and creates the logical structure, which is the endpoint. So the endpoint can span multiple data transfer nodes and creates the logical view. This provides the management and configuration interface against all those servers. So any of the network parameters, any of the administrative interface you think of for managing those servers. So that's the interface that the endpoint layer provides. Once you have that, then comes the storage system connectors. So we have specific connectors for the various storage systems that we support, and that's the add-on, that's the package that gets added to the data transfer node for the storage system you're trying to connect. So in this slide here, the example is a POSIX connector that can be used to speak to such storage systems. Once you have the connector, you then create a logical construct called the storage gateways. The storage gateways are really points in the storage system that you want to expose to the user, along with policy that governs who's allowed to access that storage and modes of access and such, right? So for example, on this slide, you see there are two storage gateways that are still speaking to the same storage system. One is on the /project space, and then the other one is on the /scratch space. So the administrator can set different policies on what sort of access is allowed in each of these. And that's the storage gateway. Like I said, we want to support multiple storage systems. So on the DTNs, you can also add additional connectors. So for example, here we have added a Google Drive connector, which can speak to Google Drive storage, and similarly create a Google Drive storage gateway that has restrictions on what parts that can be used and policies on who can use it. So you're sort of configuring parts of the storage system to expose to the users. So once you have that layer in place, then comes the data access layer, which is the collections interface. So the users access data through the collections that are on one of the storage gateways. So the collections support both grid FTP for asynchronous bulk transfers and the HTTPS protocol, and users use that to access the data. If you notice here, there are two types of collections. We have some called mapped and some called guest. So the mapped collections are the ones where access to the data requires a local account. And guest collections are modes where access to the data does not require local accounts and permissions are managed at Globus, right? So both modes of access are still supported in the new version, and the collections are hosted on a particular gateway on an endpoint. So with this model, there's a very clean separation between the servers and the interfaces for managing network parameters and the servers, which is the endpoint. Then being able to section off the same storage system and expose it with different policies. And that's what the storage gateways brings to play. And then you have the collections, which is the access layer for how the users access the data. So given the new terminology, let's talk a little bit about what's old and new for your users, right? Today on GCS 4, if users are using local account for data access, then they use host endpoints. And those are called mapped collections in the new model, right? The security flow model is that a local account is required and the data is accessed as that local account. And today what we call shared endpoints, where no local account is required and permissions are set and managed in Globus, are called guest collections in the version 5 model. If somebody is looking to create a shared endpoint today to share data access out, they search for an endpoint that they have a login on, and then they create a shared endpoint and then set permissions on it to make it available, make the data available to other users. In the new model, they will find a storage gateway and then create a guest collection on the storage gateway, and then proceed similarly, set permissions on folders that they want to share out with other users. And then lastly, in today's deployments, grid FTP is the only protocol for data access. And with version 5, the collection makes the data available both using grid FTP and the HTTPS protocol, but with the same security enforcement. So if you are sharing it out to a particular user, requiring them to log in with a particular identity, then whichever protocol they use, the same policies are applied and the same securities are applied. This is scary. It's a big change, but no reason to panic here. We are doing this in small increments, right? So we are going through and releasing incremental features on the 5 series. We have had 2 releases so far. The first one was version 5.0, which had the Google Drive support, and then 5.1, which we'll talk more about today. And we progressively plan to add features to this until we hit a particular version, which not only includes all the new features that version 5 brings, but also the ones that are available as a part of version 4. So things like multi-DTN support and other storage types that you might be using with Globus. All of that will be available. And at that point, Globus will provide a migration tool for you to be able to take your version 4 endpoints and shared endpoints and everything and migrate it into a version 5 stack. So when we have all those features, we will make that available. Until then, we expect most users will continue to run version 4 in production and then choose version 5 based on the features that we are making available. We'll continue to support version 4 through all of this evolution. And once we have version 5.n here, the one that supports the migration, we'll continue to support version 4 for at least 6 months, or so there is enough time for you to migrate and move your users to the new model. Okay? So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to shift over and talk about version 5.1, which is the one that was released about 2 weeks ago. So 5.1 had some specific features building off what was available in 5.0. We added support for POSIX and POSIX storage system in addition to the Google Drive we were supporting. So you could stand up a single endpoint that can support 2 types of storage systems, POSIX and Google Drive. 5.1 only supports guest collections. So users will create a guest collection, which used to be called a shared endpoint, and then use that for accessing data or sharing data out with collaborators. It supports both HTTPS and GridFTP access to the data. So the guest collections support both protocol. This version is a single DTN install. So your endpoint only has one server, and you'd have to install 5.1. In a future version here, we will be supporting multi-DTN installs, but 5.1 is a single DTN install. And then finally, for 5.1, to be able to access a storage gateway that is set up on 5.1, the user has to log in with one of the identity providers that is supported for logging into Globus. And what I mean by this is when you install version 4, you could say the security mechanism is something, an identity provider that you operate. So it could be your cluster's login or a separate identity provider, which is really not supported for logging in with Globus. So it could be an identity provider that you run independent of how somebody's logging into Globus. We don't have that custom piece done yet. So for 5.1, the user will have to log in using one of the identity providers supported in Globus, and the policy for storage gateways will have to use one of such identity providers. That's still a pretty wide range. We have over 400 identity providers there, and a lot of campuses are included. So for admins out there who install version 4, if you're using CI logon, you're covered on this. So 5.1 supports any of the identity providers that you would use when you configure GCS4 with that model. So I'm going to do an installation here, but I want to just do a quick overview of what those different pieces in the installation look like. So the first one is just download and install the binary. We support various platforms just like we did for version 4. So you'll find the one that's for your platform, download and install that. But the second step here is different, where the new endpoint that you're installing will have to be registered with Globus Auth. And I'll demo this. And that step will yield a client ID and a secret. The client ID uniquely identifies this endpoint. So that's one additional step that you would not have done in your previous installations. So once you have that, you will update the configuration file with the client ID, secret, few other configuration parameters, just like you do with your version 4, and run the setup. At the end of that, an endpoint is set up. Then you can add the connectors for the requisite storage system. So if you're doing a endpoint that only supports POSIX, you would add the POSIX connector. If you also want Google Drive, you would add that connector software. So that's a software added there. Once that's done, you can create the storage gateways, and that's where you would say which part of the storage system you want to expose, and then what policy you want to associate with it, whether you're supporting guest collections or whether you're supporting only mapped, and what policies you need there. So that's the sort of policies you would add in that step. So I'm going to switch over here for a second to do a demo. So as with everything else, our documentation is on docs.globus.org. And if you go to the guide section, you'll see a Globus Connect Server version 5 install guide. And that actually has an overview with the introduction that I just provided today that talks about the terminology and lays out what the various pieces are. I'm going to go to the installation section. To just save us a little bit of time, I downloaded all the packages. So I'm going to go ahead and run the basic install command here. And while that installation happens, I'm going to skip and show you the second step. So I mentioned that the second step here is registering this endpoint with Globus Auth. So the page you go to is developers.globus.org, and you register your application here. So the organizing model here is that we have concepts of projects, and the registrations are managed within projects. And one of the good reasons to add projects is you can have admins, so multiple people can manage the registration. So let me create one here. And the contact email is helpful. This is where we send product announcements, any updates and things. So once I create the project, I can go ahead and add a Globus Connect server. It says add new Globus Connect server. That's the option I'm going to choose. And I'll give it a display name. And once that is done here, you can see this is the display name of that registration. And then there's a client ID. This now uniquely identifies this endpoint. And then we'll need to get a client secret and configure that information into the install. So let's see where we are. So the install is done here. So now if let's go back. So everything that I just did is also documented here. So you can see it talks about going to the developers.globus page and doing the installation. So now I can open up Okay, so if you open up the configuration file, you can see it asks for the client ID. So I'm going to take the client ID from my registration. And then it asks for a client secret. So you can generate a new secret. And this is set up such that you can rotate secrets So after a period of time, if you want to delete this and rotate through, or we're also working on providing some APIs here for automation. So here's the client secret, and this is how the endpoint installation is going to authenticate. Then I can give this server a name. By default, it takes the DNS name. So I'm going to do a name for the server. Then there's two other pieces of configuration that's required. We use certificates from Let's Encrypt for the server. So that requires an administrator email, so they can email you when it's about to expire or if they have other notifications, and you'll have to agree to their terms and conditions. So this is the basic configuration. There's other pieces that you can do, and the documentation talks about that, right? So once you register the endpoint, you will make those changes to the configuration file, and the documentation walks through the changes that are needed and what you need to set. Once that is done, then you run the setup command. For anyone who has done a GCS4 install, this should look very, very familiar. So this step goes through and uses the client ID and secret and registers the endpoint and configures it. At the end of this run, we should have the endpoint ready for use. While that is running, I want to point out, when you do this in production, you want to make sure that the project that you create has other people as admins. So you have multiple people who can manage this. Anybody I add as an admin here can now manage this registration under this particular project. So they can come in and make changes, they can generate new client secrets and so on. So they have access to everything on this project. So running through here. So while that's happening, once the installation is set up, many of you know that Globus requires for some of the features to be enabled that an endpoint be set as managed, that is covered under a subscription. At this time, we don't have a self-service way for you to convert a GCS5 endpoint into managed. So if you read the instruction, it talks about you emailing us the endpoint UUID, so emailing support, and we will set it up as managed. In the future version, that'll change, so you'll be able to flag the endpoint as managed as soon as you're done with the install. Now the installation is complete. You can see here that I have an endpoint UUID. This is the endpoint that was set up, and we also get a DNS name for the endpoint in glob.us name. So let me go back to my slides for a minute here and talk through some of the differences. So from the version 4 installation, what are the differences, right? So first of all, you notice I did not have to provide a Globus ID username password. So there is no Globus ID needed for this installation. Then the second thing is that port 443 rather than 2811 will be used as a grid FTP control channel. So in the documentation, we have a section on what ports need to be opened. They're going to look different from your GCS4. The endpoint was created using that client identity. So when I did the registration on the developers page, right here, a client ID was generated that uniquely identifies it. And the client secret is used to authenticate you for this client ID. So that's a separate identity in the Globus system, and that's what is used. That's the owner of this endpoint, and that's the identity used. So this replaces the need for Globus ID or anything like that. Each collection is assigned a DNS name in the glob.us namespace. So you noticed when the endpoint was installed, the URL here has a DNS name in the glob.us namespace. So every collection also will have that, and that's what you would use when you do HTTPS access to the data. And we are transitioning the Globus transfer service to also start using that as the unique name for the collections. certificates are obtained from Let's Encrypt. So this is automatically done. So we go out to that service and obtain a certificate. It's valid for 90 days. And one of the reasons the setup took some time is we also have an automated cron job running in the background that does the renewal of the certificates for you. So all those certificates are coming from that service and they're valid for 90 days. The renewal should happen automatically without the administrator having to be in the middle. And now that we have the basic endpoint, we still have to create a storage gateway to make the data accessible using the endpoint. So let's go do that. So first thing, if you guys were doing this install, you would be sending us the endpoint ID to set it as a managed endpoint. So now you can also add other admins to this endpoint. So now that you have set it up, you probably want to have other people to have admin roles on this endpoint. So I can go ahead and add my Globus identity as an admin on this endpoint. So these are commands that are local on the machine where you installed it. So it's a GCS config is the name of the command. And I'm adding an admin role for a particular identity. So once that is done, we can go back to the Globus web app. And if I search for GCS, my endpoint that I just installed, I can go look at the roles, and you see that the endpoint, this is the registration, the client ID that we got when we registered, and then this is the role that I just added as the admin role. So now we have an endpoint, we have some admins on that. Let's go add a storage gateway. Copy the command here for a second. Talk through this command. So this is using, again, same the GCS config option. I'm adding a storage gateway here, and it's of the type POSIX. So you notice that I say the connector type is POSIX. I say the display name is GCS 5.1 data store. So that's the display name of the storage gateway that I'm adding. And I want it to be for this part of the file system. So all the files and folders under /data are going to be available through this storage gateway. And then I'm going to require that someone have a globus.org identity to be able to access that storage gateway. Once I do this, an actual storage gateway is created, and now users can go and access this, right? So what we have now, once you're done with this, with these steps that I just showed you, is an endpoint that has the Globus Connect server running with a POSIX connector, and we called it the GCS 5.1 server. And that's where you would modify all the server configuration, network use parameters, and such. Then I also now added a storage gateway called GCS 5.1 data store, which is for all the data under this folder /data. And this is where I would manage policies on who can access this, access the storage gateway, and a policy such that only guest collections can be created, restrict paths and such is set here, right? So now let's see how a user accesses this. So if I go back to so I have this option here now to add a shared endpoint. This is really a guest collection. So the first time they do this, the application that's walking them through the ad will ask permissions to act on their behalf. So this is a standard consent that we see with use of Globus. So this was the endpoint we created, and I want to add a guest collection to this gateway, right? This is the storage gateway that I'd created. So I'm going to go ahead and use that storage gateway. My options are limited because the storage gateway required add globus.org account. So this is my globus.org account. And then I'm going to hit continue here. And this is going to look very familiar to anyone who's created shared endpoints, right? So you give it a display name. So let's say data share, share example. And then I'll give it keyword GCSV 5.1. And then I can create an endpoint. This is very much like creating a shared endpoint. So once I do that, I can use this for moving data in and out. So this was a share that I created. So let's go to another Globus endpoint and copy over a couple of files. So this is much like any other endpoint that we have, right? And now this is accessible using HTTPS. So now I can ask for text files to be just downloaded directly. So the HTTPS server that is running also needs consent here. So I'm going to allow access of data from there. And the README file gets downloaded. I can also do the same with a PNG. Let's see what happens here. The Globus logo file, right? So I just created a guest collection on this new storage gateway, and I'm now able to move file in and out. I can share from this and also use HTTPS access. Let's look at another one we have previously installed that has multiple storage gateways. So this one is a demo endpoint we have running. And if I try to add a collection on that one, I actually will be given a choice. So we have both a POSIX storage gateway and a Google Drive one there. So I can choose where I want to add my collection. So let's say I want to create a collection on the Google Drive one. Very similar, it has policy that says at globus.org needs to be used. So I can do Google Drive demo, and then I can create a guest collection there, which accesses data that is sitting on my Google Drive. If I ask for, you can see here on the left, it's the Google Drive that's sitting on my at globus.org Google account, right? So now we have a single endpoint that is supporting multiple storage systems and has multiple gateways that users can use. So now that you saw the features on 5.1, what it's capable of, just want to give a little bit of an idea on where we see people adopting 5.1 now, right? So the first one is anybody looking to continue the Google Drive support. We know we have a lot of customers who deployed Google Drive with 5.0, or someone who's looking to provide Google Drive on their campus. 5.1 should be what you would use. Anyone who's running 5.0 today should migrate to 5.1. We have directly contacted you earlier this week, giving you instructions for migration so you can preserve all your collections and things. But you will see features added on from 5.1. So it'd be good to migrate over to 5.1. But if you're looking to support Google Drive for your researchers, then 5.1 is what you would install. If you're looking to provide HTTP access to data on guest collections, then that's another good reason to deploy 5.1. And you can drop in the connector, a POSIX connector, if you will, and then allow access to the data. You're also welcome to pilot this, set up a 5.1 endpoint, and both give us feedback in terms of installation and administrative aspects, but also make it available to your users and provide us feedback, right? So we see two core use cases for why you would deploy 5.1 immediately. We still recommend everybody run 4 in production for the general use case. And like I pointed out in my timeline slide, there will be a point where we'll provide migration from 4 to 5. So what's coming next? The next big point release here, 5.2, will focus on providing management of higher assurance data. So specifically data that is controlled but unclassified, or data that has PHI and requires a BAA covered under HIPAA. So that's the release that is coming next. And if you are interested in this and you have needs to provide high assurance data access, please contact us. We are happy to have the conversation, talk about what is going to be a part of that release. That'll be the 5.2 version that'll come out, and that'll also have support for mapped collections. So you could use both guest and mapped collections with high assurance data. I'll close with this slide. We'll open it for Q&A. I have pointers here for our documentation. Everything is linked off docs.globus.org. The introduction I provided with the new terminology and the architecture, that is also documented in the version 5 installation guide. So I should give you a good intro into what the various pieces are in the version 5 architecture, and you will need that as you do the installation. As always, you can email us at support@globus with any questions. If you're trying out 5.1 or looking to migrate, please reach out and we're happy to help. I also wanted to highlight something that is recent. We have started to email out when we have new blog posts and PRs. So if you'd like to be notified on announcements, whether it's product announcements or interesting things that we post on our blog, you will find a way to subscribe to that on globus.org/contact us. So you could go there and see how you can subscribe to those notifications. Okay. So with that, I think we're going to open it up for Q&A. Vas?
Great. Thanks. Thanks very much, Rachana. So please post your questions in the chat window. We do have one question right now, Rachana, and that is, will I be able to set up an anonymous storage gateway for anyone to download in version 5?
So is this trying to think. So with the guest collection, you can set up access to be public, which would be anonymous HTTP access. Is that what? If that's the question, then yes, you would be able to support access to the data without the user having to log in.
Okay, great. And then we have a question about the Let's Encrypt certificates being generated, confirming that it's generated against the glob.us domain and not the institution's own domain name.
Right.
So what happens if the DTN's IP address changes? Does that impact that in any way?
So yes, it is generated against the glob.us domain name. We do have plans to allow you to set up a CNAME, so you would be able to add a CNAME so people would not see the glob.us name, but rather they might see something in your institution's DNS. I don't have a succinct answer for the steps if your IP changes, but I suspect you would have to update your endpoint definition, and that's going to change the validation when the certificate renews.
Okay. And then there's a question about, do we have any projected timeline for when v5 will have feature parity with v4?
I don't have any hard timelines on that. We are certainly shooting for providing a version that has all the new features in 5 plus the features in 4, specifically the multi-DTN and the other connectors, potentially by end of the year. But I don't have a hard timeline on that. We will be doing incremental releases, so you'll clearly see us making progress towards that. So I also want to clarify the version when it goes out will not be just feature parity. So you'll still get all these new features, all the collections, the HTTPS and all of that, in addition to supporting pieces that are in V4. So yeah, I expect sometime by the end of the year would be there. But you should see lots of announcements from us and point releases along the way.
Okay, and then question about permissions, admin access to the endpoint. So can you give a Globus group admin access to an endpoint instead of individual users?
Yes. So the admin role can be granted to specific users or to groups. Yes.
Okay. Do we expect any interoperability issues if people are moving data between a version 4 and a version 5 endpoint?
A really good question. No, we are explicitly supporting that. We'll make sure that if people who continue to run GCS 4 and version 5 endpoints, there should be no issues moving data between those. Right.
Okay. That's all the questions we have right now. If there are any more questions, please post them in the chat. Give you a couple of minutes here. Okay, it looks like we have no more questions. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and thanks very much, Rachana, for the informative presentation. As I mentioned earlier, this webinar is being recorded, so we will make this available, and we'll send out an announcement to the list if you'd like to go back and take a look at it again. Thanks, everyone, and have a good day.